Well, hello there, and welcome to Subversive Radio. This is an ongoing podcast series that we're in the moment, House Church 101, and I believe this is the fourth one in the series. I'm actually losing a little bit of track right now, but I think this is the fourth one. I'm your host, Keith Giles. If you don't know who I am, you can go to my blog, which is keithgiles.com. That's KEITHGILES.com. I've written several books. They're all available for purchase and for free PDF or ebook download, most of them. I believe all of them, actually, in one form or the other, or you can read them on my blog, or follow me on Twitter or on Facebook. So I would like to talk about something it's part of this series, the House Church 101 series. I've already talked about what it is and what it looks like. Those are our first two in the series. The second one was a little bit on what leadership looks like in the context of an open meeting. And I wanted to talk about a little bit, it's a little bit of a tangent issue, but it's something that someone specifically asked me to talk about this a couple of weeks ago, and then it also came up again as a subject this week on Facebook. Some of the organic groups that I'm a part of on Facebook as a point of discussion, and it just seems like it is something that a lot of Christians are curious about. And so I figured, you know what, let's go ahead and cover this topic. And it's the topic of, I'm calling it from pulpit to tent making. So what ends up happening is, and this is my own personal story, and I'm going to share a little bit about my experience in just a moment, but in general, just to kind of set up what we're going to talk about now. People like myself who were licensed and ordained to the ministry, who were primarily receiving their employment and their salary, their money to support themselves and their children, their wives and their families. They were receiving that support through the church. And if you're like me and you're in the middle of that, and you begin to feel the Lord nudging you away from that and towards something more like an organic, open church, New Testament style of church meeting, because you have convictions, you start to feel differently about things. You start to see and read and understand Scripture in a different way. And you begin to realize that you really can't do that anymore in good faith, in good conscience. And so you feel you need to step away from the traditional church model, to also step away from receiving a salary for that, and then to step into really what is the great unknown. So in other words, it isn't just that you're stepping away from, the way that you gather and the way that you think of what church is, and into this more New Testament organic style church, which is a leap in itself. That's a huge stretch for anybody. But you have the additional struggle of also on a very, very practical level, figuring out this mystery of how in the world you are supposed to transition into the workforce, really, away from a model where, not only a model where you're the teacher and the preacher every Sunday, but where, your livelihood comes from the tithes and offerings from the church. And I already have, over at my blog again, if you go to my blog, I've got there's to the right, near the top, there's a little tab that you can click on that says My Podcasts and Subversive Radio. And if you click on that, you can see a whole lot of podcasts that I've done. And I've done one under the Blog Talk Radio section. I've done one in the past already specifically about pastoral compensation, discussing whether it is or it isn't biblical. And I don't want to redo that. I don't want to rehash that here. If you want to study that specifically or think about that specifically, I'd encourage you to go there to my website, to my blog, and listen to that podcast. So I don't want to spend our time making the point that it is or it isn't biblical. I personally don't believe it is, at least for myself. I don't believe it is biblical, that people should be financially compensated for loving their brothers and sisters. We don't get paid to love people or to use our gifting in the church. It's something that we do with joy and with gladness because we can. But so anyway, now you've got this added, burden to figure this out. And it was a burden for me. And it is a burden. I've talked to people on my blog, and I've emailed people, and I've talked to people over the phone from all around the United States senior pastors, youth pastors, associate pastors, but people who are, they have wives and they have children. And, this is really, most of them, this is their schooling. This is where, they have their degrees in seminary. All they really know is how to teach and preach and, do things in the church. That's all they've ever studied for. That's all they've ever known. Their resume, if they took that out of their resume, there would be really not much there. Maybe they delivered pizzas when they were in high school, or they had a paper route when they were a kid. But beyond those things and where their vocation is now, there's just not a lot there. And that is a very real problem. It's a struggle for a lot of Christians. As I said, I've talked to a lot of people. Some of these guys are my friends, and I've talked to them on the phone, and they've said, Keith, I'm going to step away. This upcoming Sunday is my last Sunday. I'm going to turn in my resignation, but I don't know what we're going to do. We have a little bit of savings, or, I'm going to try to maybe get a job, at a fast food place, or maybe doing some sales, but I'm 30 years old, I'm 40 years old, I'm 50 years old, etc. And it's just like starting your career out of high school or out of college or something. It is really, really difficult. It isn't easy. And so I just want to say, if that's you, I feel your pain. I have been there. When I was in my early 40s, was when we as a family felt God calling us out of traditional church, away from that full-time staff position, to step into this organic church model. And we knew that the only way we were going to be able to pull that off, because our vision was to have a house church family where all of the offering, 100% of the offering, every last penny of it, it all went to care for the poor in our community and in our body if need be, but that money belonged to people in need. It did not belong to any one of us. And that the only way, of course, for us to pull that off would be if we met in people's homes, number one, and number two, if I just got a job in the workforce. And that was a difficult time. I have been out of work twice in my life. Once, the first time, was a year and a half after I was laid off from a job that I really loved doing. At the time, I worked for Vineyard Music Group. I was the director of sales and distribution for Vineyard Music Group up here in Yorba Linda. And they were going through a transitional time. I did a couple of rounds of layoffs. I ended up getting laid off. Thought I would find a job, and I didn't. It took me a year and a half. And God taught me a whole lot during that year and a half about what it meant to trust Him for daily bread. It was a huge time of spiritual growth in my life. And as painful and as difficult as it was, doing a lot of odd jobs and temporary work and stuff I hated doing, things that were outside my comfort zone, God paid every bill. We never missed a meal. We were taken care of. God showed Himself faithful, and He taught me something about Himself and about myself and my family and how much He loves us during that time. And then the second time I was out of work was for a whole year, and that was between the time that I stepped away to start the house church and until I found employment, quote unquote, a tent-making job, as Paul the Apostle describes it, in the workforce. And so that year was also another very painful and trying and challenging and difficult year for me and for my family. Because here we went again. Once more, we had to go for a year not knowing what was going to happen and having to depend on God for daily bread and to walk by faith. That's what you're stepping into. I just want to tell you right now, again, if that's you, if you are on staff as a pastor right now and you feel God convicting your heart to step away from that to take a salary and an offering is something that's against God's plan for you and for your life, and that you shouldn't be charging people to love them and serve them and minister to them. If that's your conviction, if you feel God saying that to you and you feel God calling you into this direction, I want to warn you ahead of time, count the cost like Jesus says, because you are stepping into a season, which could be a few months. Like me, it could be a year or more. But you're going to step into a season where you are going to walk by faith and really just lay everything out there and trust God. This is not easy. This is not the easy step 1, 2, 3 podcast, I'm sorry to say. I wish it was, but it's not. It is challenging. And so we stepped away from that without getting into all the little minutia of the details. I basically stepped away from. I had 2 part-time jobs. One working on staff at the local church here we had helped to plant as a youth minister. As a children's minister. Well, I guess I technically was youth as well, junior high, and youth minister and Compassion Ministries minister. And then another ministry called Soul Survivor USA, which was a nonprofit ministry that did events for college students and high school students in the summers. And so I just quit both of those, stepped away from them, and really went into I did a lot of temporary work. Again, out of my comfort zone, very painful, very difficult, but spiritually a time of growth in my life. And what was interesting was we had already started the house church. So the house church was already meeting in our home, and everyone who was there, every time we got together, they would get another, every week or twice a week, because we met on Thursday evenings and Sunday mornings. Twice a week, they would get an update from us about how the job hunting was going, how our finances were going, how our faith was holding out or not holding out. And you know what? It was actually, not only was it a growth time for us as a family, just my wife and myself and our children, my 2 boys, it was actually a beautiful growing time for our entire church family, because our whole church family went through that with us, and they got to see us walk by faith, and to see that, for us it was worth it. It was worth it to follow our heart, to follow our conviction in this direction. So for myself, the way I sort of answered that riddle, that problem of, what do we do now, is really, and I know this isn't going to really help you, but I'm just going to tell you how I did it. From the time I was in my early 20s, when I got licensed and ordained to the Southern Baptist Convention in Texas as a minister of the gospel, I have always had one foot in the church and one foot out. So I've always I've kind of alternated between being a youth pastor over here, and then I might go and work in retail somewhere. And then I would work, I worked in the Christian music industry for a while, and then I went over to plant a church here in Tustin for a while. And then I went back I worked for a nonprofit, but again, that was more as a marketing coordinator, and I was doing a lot of marketing and that kind of thing, a lot of writing and stuff like that. So when I was faced with this, and again, I'd already had a year of being out of work anyway, so a year and a half before that, where I had been out of work once before and had to go through a temporary agency and that kind of thing to kind of make ends meet. And I made probably a third of what I was making from before, so it wasn't much at all. We still depended on the grace of God and the generosity of the body of Christ and friends who, and family members who were really, really good to us during that time. Just God provided through them, and it was beautiful. But because I had developed some skill sets already all along the way, I was developing skill sets in sales and in marketing. And that allowed me to go back to where I am now, where I'd been there once before. I had left there, and I went back into their marketing department as a copywriter, like a advertising and marketing copywriter for them, which is where I've been now for 6 years. And that's been awesome. That's been a wonderful blessing for me and my family. And but I know what that is like. It took me a year to do that. It wasn't a slam dunk. It was a year of, growing spiritually and trusting God. But that was something where I had a marketable skill already that I eventually was able to find a job in. The people that I know who have followed that same path, some of them have gone back to school. Some of them have gone into sales, selling insurance or just commission sales. Some of them have gone to work. One friend of mine went to work for a bank, I believe, as a bank teller. And another friend of mine has just kind of done a whole lot of odd jobs. Some things online, some things on eBay, some things doing some video work here and there, a little bit of teaching some music lessons on the side. And so those, you kind of just do what you have to do. And so it's going to be different for everyone. It's not going to be a slam dunk. There unfortunately isn't, as I said, any sort of a step one, do this, step two, do that. It really is, what it really is throwing yourself on the mercy of God and depending on God for your daily bread. And I think that's on purpose, because I think this entire calling into this open church, this organic expression of New Testament church, The whole thing is depending on God. The entire thing, it only works to the degree that we are completely dependent on Jesus. And so if we're used to doing that when it comes to feeding our families, if we're used to doing that already because that's how we're paying our bills and that's how we're putting gas in the car, if we're leaning on God and we're drawing near to Jesus for those things, then it's just natural for us to continue in that posture of looking to Him and depending on Him and throwing ourselves before His mercy when we come together as a church family. I think it may be by design that the only way it works is that this kind of a thing forces us to completely depend on the Lord for everything. And I really think that's even what the whole Christian walk is about. I mean, for me, a lot of the struggles that I've gone through in my life, I believe, is just God's way of saying, do you trust me? It's God putting me in scenarios constantly where the question comes up again, where God once again says to me, well, okay, Keith, do you trust me now? Okay, now do you trust me? Oh, this challenge just came up, but do you trust me? Hey, this thing just happened and you're not sure how you're going to take care of it, but do you trust me? Hey, this bill just came out of nowhere. You don't have the money to pay it, but do you trust me? And that, I think, if I could just summarize the Christian walk into one simple sentence, for me, this is what I would say it is. For me, it's God's question, do you trust me? And the more I learn to trust Him, the less I freak out the next time something comes up that's unexpected. The more quickly I lay things at His feet without worrying about them or without freaking out over them. And really, the more joy I have because I do trust Him and because I'm able to realize that He's there. He's with me. He sees me. He knows my need. He knows my family. He knows what we're going through. And He's there for us. And He will never leave me or forsake me. And again, I've learned that in my life through a year and a half of being out of work and God providing miraculously for us. And then later on, when God called us to step out and let Him really basically plant and grow and nourish a house church family in our home 7 years ago, He asked us again to trust Him. And He was faithful. And again, it took a year. But again, during that year, we were cared for, we were taken care of. And God was faithful. And I believe that that's a beautiful lesson for us as Christians to learn. And this kind of gives us an opportunity to do that. That's really all, the main thing I wanted to share with you is just to discuss that. I think going forward, I might try to interview a few of these people specifically and let you hear their stories and what God spoke to them as they were going through this and trying to figure out, okay, God, how do I do this? And as I said, some of my friends, it took them a few months, and I have a couple of friends who are still trying to figure it out. They really haven't landed on the one thing, that's how they're going to take care of their family, but they're trusting that God is taking care of their family. And so I would just encourage you, if God is calling you in that direction, if you are right now someone who is taking a salary from your church, but you feel the Lord is calling you to step away from that, please contact me. Leave a comment on this podcast or over at my blog. Shoot me an email or a message on Twitter or Facebook, and let me know. It's been my privilege and my honor and my blessing to be able to pray with people like that, to hear your story, to encourage you if I can. And really, the main thing I can tell you is that if God really is calling you in this direction and you are being asked to pay that kind of a price, I can promise you a couple things. One, it's worth it. Two, you really can trust God. And three, He loves you and your family more than you do. So you can trust Him and He will be faithful. And again, as I said, if you want to look further into this question of, taking a salary from a church, if that's something that are we allowed to do that or not allowed to do that? There's some stuff over at my blog. And here's one thing I will share, is this, I came across a pretty interesting writing from Tertullian. He's a 2nd century church father. And so really what it is a window. I call it Tertullian's window, because Tertullian's writing here kind of gives us a window into the early church and how they perceived this, what they did with their money, and how the early church treated these kind of things. It's actually taken from Tertullian's Apology. It's from a book called Roman Civilization, Sourcebook 2, The Empire, page 588. And here it is. I'm going to just read this quote to you. This is, again, Tertullian speaking to us from the 2nd century. And Tertullian says, speaking about the early Christian church, "We are a society with a common religious feeling, unity of discipline, a common bond of hope. We meet in gatherings and congregations to approach God in prayer, massing our forces to surround Him. We meet to read the divine scriptures. Our presidents are elders of proven character. Even if there is a treasury of a sort, it is not made up of money paid in initiation fees as if religion were a matter of contract. Every man, once a month, brings some modest contribution, or whatever he wishes, and only if he does wish, and if he can. For no one is compelled. It is a voluntary offering to feed the poor and to bury them, for boys and girls who lack property and parents, and then for slaves grown old. So we, who are united in mind and soul, have no hesitation about sharing property. All is common among us, except our wives. At that point, we dissolve our partnership. Our dinner shows its idea in its name. It is called by the Greek name for love, agape. We do not take our places at table until we have first partaken in prayer to God. Only so much is eaten as satisfies hunger. After water for the hands come the lights, and then each, from what he knows of the Holy Scriptures, or from his own heart, is called before the rest to sing to God. Prayer in like manner ends the banquet. And so right there, this to me is a beautiful picture of what it would be like if you could go back to the early church in the 2nd century and step through the door and join with them, not only in this feast where everyone shares something, singing from their heart to God, sharing from the Scriptures what they know, or just from their own heart, to bless one another in love. But what he says about the treasury is, again, an eye-opener. The idea that once a month, people are not compelled, but only if they want to bring what he says is a, quote, modest contribution. And only if he does wish, he says, and only if he can. It is a voluntary offering. But what is it for? Well, Tertullian says it's to feed the poor and to bury them, for orphans, and then for slaves who have grown too old, basically, to become useful, and are kind of cast aside. That probably correlates to what we would call our modern homeless. A lot of them are old. A lot of them are incapable of working. Some of them have mental illness. But those that are elderly, either in our senior homes or on our streets. And so it's a beautiful thing that, this is what the early church did with their money. And I want to also make an offer to you as well. One of the things that really spoke to my wife and I and really inspired us to step out, to make this decision, and to start a church where every penny went to care for the poor in our community, and that the salary didn't belong to me. I had read a PDF article, it's about 20 or 30 pages long, by a guy named Ray Mayhew. It's called Embezzlement, the Corporate Sin of American Christianity. All it is a look at the early Christian church, quotes like I just read you from Tertullian and many others, and getting a really clear picture from the New Testament onward to see how the early church thought about their money, how they thought about the poor, and what they saw as their values. What mattered? What was the DNA of the Church of Jesus in those early days? And I will send that to you for free, absolutely free. If you want to, again, make a comment, leave me your email address or email me or contact me on Facebook or Twitter or at my blog or here on the podcast under the comments. Just let me know you want it. Just put embezzlement in there, and your email address, and I will be more than happy to send you a free copy of that document, which goes much more into depth about the need for us to care for the poor, and really how this idea that we have nowadays of financially compensating our leaders does not come from the New Testament. It does not come from the early Christian church. In fact, just to kind of spin you around a little bit, you may not know this, but the church, the New Testament church, did not institute formally a tithe. So the New Christian church never spoke about tithing until the year 600. 600 years afterwards. So think about that for a second. What was going on for 600 years in the New Testament church? They weren't tithing the way we typically think of people commanding us to tithe today. And so, again, by looking at what Tertullian tells us in the 2nd century, we have a pretty good idea of what they valued and what they did do with their money and where that money came from. And again, it wasn't a tithe. It wasn't mandatory. It was modest, once a month, if you wanted, whatever you wanted, and only if you could, because no one was compelled. That's very different. And again, if you were compelled to do what? To take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan. That's a really foundational thing that, again, our church family just felt that's what we needed to get back to. And again, I always say it's the best thing I've ever done with the word church on it. Thanks for your time. Thanks for listening. We will continue this series, I think, one more time at least, and to wrap things up. Thank you for listening, and I hope to speak to you again. God bless you, and let the kingdom come.